Hey, how's it going? Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. Really helps my channel out. I'm currently located somewhere on Section 4 of the California Backcountry Discovery Route. I'm not exactly sure where. I think I'm in Horse Thief Campground, which is a nice place to stay last night. Yesterday, I rolled over the 15,000 mile mark on this bike, the KTM 390 Adventure, and I thought this would be a good time to do a reliability assessment. And I'm doing this because I've been getting questions from people on the reliability of this bike, and I've seen a lot of posts of people who are interested in buying this bike, but they're concerned about the reliability. Keep in mind that most of what I'm going to talk about today is my experience on one single bike out of thousands that are out there. I did do some research on what other issues people are having. I've experienced some of those myself, so I will cover the bigger issues that came up and that you'll find posts about and discuss those. So if you're interested to know what the reliability of this bike is, stick around. One of the major issues with this bike when it first came out in the Indian market was the fuel pipe at the bottom of the tank had gotten pinched the way it was routed. Now, I believe all of that has been sorted out, but if you do some research on this bike, that's one of the things that's going to come up. It's my understanding that that hasn't been a problem in the North American and European market, but if you see it, that's where it came from. One of the major issues you're going to see when doing research on this bike is that it has a stalling issue. And that stall occurs when you're at a higher RPM or higher speeds, usually in 4th, 5th, 6th gear, and you pull in the clutch from a higher RPM and the RPMs drop, it will stall, the engine will die. And it'll take dropping the clutch back out to get the wheels spinning and it'll start back up. My experience with that prior to some maintenance I had done was it would happen once a day, maybe once every other day. It wasn't extremely frequent, but it was happening. Now, I didn't have that problem for the first couple thousand miles that I had the bike, but then it got progressively more frequent as I rode the bike. When you do your research, you're going to see people talking about a variety of different ways to fix it. I saw one post from a guy in India who did a video that said it was the clutch switch, the slider was installed backwards in the switch, and if you put it in right, that won't happen. I'm not sure that that is the issue, because if that was the case, it would happen more frequently if that switch was put in wrong. I've also heard, and this is the one that I'm leaning more towards, is that this bike runs really lean in order to meet emission standards. And when you drop it from the high RPM to a low RPM, it doesn't have enough fuel at that bottom to keep it running, and it flames out. That's kind of what I'm thinking is happening. I am not an expert on these engines. I am not a mechanical engineer. What changed for me to go from having the stalling issue to no longer having it is I took the bike in to have the valves checked at the 8,000 mile mark. When I took them in, the right side, the intake and exhaust valves were tight and the shims had to be replaced. I also had the firmware updated. So from that service of having the valves checked and the shims replaced and getting the firmware done, from that point forward, I haven't had that stalling issue anymore. So if you're having that stalling issue, no matter where you're at in the mileage, I recommend just go in and have the valves checked. I think it cost me about $180 to take it in. I only had the valves checked. I did not have any other maintenance done, and they did need to be adjusted. So that would be my recommendation with that particular issue. Another issue on this bike that's came up is the drive chain is not a very good chain. It's wearing out between 6,000 and 8,000 miles. Just about everybody I've seen with this bike has had some issues with that, myself included. When I was riding through Baja, I was hitting about that 6,000 mile mark, and the bike, I was having to adjust the chain every single day because it was stretching that much. I replaced it with a new chain sprocket. My recommendation is, if you buy one of these bikes, replace the chain right away while your front and rear sprockets are basically new, and let them break in with a new chain. It doesn't cost a lot to replace the chain, and you'll get 15,000 to 20,000 miles out of that setup, as opposed to 6 or 8 if you stay with the standard chain. In my research, another thing that I found was people are having fork seals leak on this bike. I saw several posts where people had that issue. A few of them, the dealership replaced the seals for them. I think it depends on the amount of miles. KTM looks at seals as a wear item, and they're not likely to replace those. I have 15,000 miles. I keep saying that, but just to give you an idea how many miles, about 4,000 of those have been off-road. I've even changed the fork springs on this bike, and I haven't had any issues with the seals. I think it just kind of depends on how it was assembled. So if you have seal issues, just have to get them replaced, and that's not an uncommon thing on bikes. That happens. One of the major issues that I had with this bike was the rear shock. The seals on the shock leaked, and I lost all the oil out of it, and it turned the bike into a pogo stick for about 2,000 miles because I was out on a long trip. KTM did cover that under warranty because I was around the 12,000 mile mark, and it was only a year on the bike. They said that that was a one-time deal. They wouldn't do it again because they consider the shock also to be a wear item. I was thankful that it was replaced, but I have seen other posts of other people also having that issue. I think the 790 is known to have that issue as well. My opinion on this is that the resonator, the exhaust resonator, is located so close to the shock that there's a lot of heat coming off that resonator that's going into the shock, and if you're putting the shock working it really hard, especially on off-road, you're building a lot of heat in the shock on its own, and then you have the heat from the resonator. Eventually those seals are going to go. So that's what I think has contributed to that problem. I was just talking about the shock. I was doing some work on the bike, and I noticed that the replacement shock that I got in September has already leaked, and I've got oil coming out everywhere, and now it's starting to feel like a pogo again. So this apparently is quite an issue, at least for me on this bike. I'm not sure how many of you out there have had that. Granted, I ride in very rough terrain. With all of my luggage, it puts a lot of pressure on this shock. I've made a modification to the bike, to the exhaust, to try to keep heat off of the shock. So I think I'm gonna have to go aftermarket because I can't rely on these shocks, and I'm pretty confident KTM is not going to warranty this new shock that they just gave me. I have some ideas of how to solve that, but I will discuss that in a separate video. One small little thing that's came up is the kickstand switch. When I flip the kickstand up, the switch doesn't always see it right away. It just requires me to kick it with my heel to get it up all the way. I think that's partly because the swivel on the kickstand is dirty, and with all the off-road riding I'm doing, and then you get a little bit of oil that comes off, or chain lube that comes off of the chain and drips in there, it's made it a bit sticky. I lubed the swivel, and this trip it's been fine. I haven't had any issues, but that's just something that I've noticed. Very, very, very minor thing, and it's probably because I don't keep my bike as clean as I should. All right, let's talk about the engine real quick. If you don't know, this engine, the 390, was developed by KTM, or first put in a bike in, I think, 2013 in the 390 Duke. So this engine has been around for a long time. KTM has a lot of experience with it. I think they made some tweaks in 2018, and that's basically the same engine that is in this bike right now. So this engine has been around a long time. They know a lot about it. It is a proven engine and is known for its reliability. Now, I will say that, as I had mentioned before, once you get around 5,000 to 6,000 miles or more, especially if you're having a stalling issue, I recommend go in and get the valves checked. Don't rely on, well, it's not at that mileage. It really depends on how the assembly is and how the engine breaks in, that it may be in a position where you need to get the valves checked. You may need to have those shims changed. So it doesn't cost a lot. I think I paid $180, as I mentioned before, to get just the valves done, and it's worthwhile doing. The engine overall, haven't had any issues with it. One other thing people ask about is the brakes. I saw some comments that their brakes were squealing. I personally haven't had any issues with the brakes. I think the brakes on this thing work really, really well because it's lightweight. A single rotor up front works great, but as far as the grip and the pad wear, I've got probably another 20,000-30,000 miles I can put on the front brakes and equally as much on the rear brakes. So from a reliability standpoint, they've always worked, always done their job. One of the questions I got when I first got this bike had to do with an issue that came up in India with the calipers, the brake calipers. My understanding is the bolt that they used in attaching the caliper to the fork wasn't long enough, or there was some sort of issue with that. I think that was all sorted out in India. I have not heard that in North America, but that is something you may see if you're doing research on this bike. Haven't had any issues. I haven't seen any recalls on it, and I've had the bike to the dealer. Nothing came up with it. Electronics is always a question when you start adding new electronics, how those are going to work. One of the known issues with this bike is the traction control. If you stall the bike and it shuts off, 8 out of 10 times it's going to go back to the traction control being on, and then you have to manually turn it off. It can be a pain in the butt if you're doing more technical off-road riding where you might be stalling the bike. I've had a few issues with it, but overall, I just accept that that's one of the quirks of this bike. I believe on the 2022 model that they're advertising that issue has been fixed and that the bike will hold whatever settings that you've set on it when you turn it off and turn it back on, which is a great feature and a good upgrade. I don't know if the older bikes, if the new firmware from those bikes can be put in. I'm hoping that's the case. I'll find out the next time I take it in to get the valves done. I'll ask them about that. One thing that I have been able to do is I have been able to generate an ECU failure on this bike. The way I've done that is with the traction control off, lean the bike over and just do a U-turn by spinning the rear wheel. And when I've done that, I think because it's leaned over, the lean angle sensor is sensing that, and it may not be turning off like it should when the traction control is off, and it's creating an ECU failure. All you have to do is turn the bike off and turn it back on. I haven't made a big deal about it. I haven't gone to KTM and said, hey, there's this issue, because it's not something I do very often, especially when I'm fully loaded. I don't spin it like that. And this is what a majority of my riding is. But I have had that experience. I think I saw 1 or 2 other posts of people having ECU failures. That's how I got it. The last thing is the plastics. I'll talk about that real quick. I saw a post when I was doing my research that someone had some plastic pieces breaking, mostly on this front fairing here. And I took a look at mine, and one of the tabs on this front fairing had also broken. Now that person said they hadn't done any off-roading, and it looked cracked, and it looked like it had been over-tightened when it was put together. This, just the one tab, is just a floating one that snaps in. Look down below here, that tab is broken on this right side wing. And this other tab here is one that I've seen some video of pictures of people saying this breaks as well. In case you're curious, this whole wing, if you were to purchase this, it's $8. It's not terribly expensive. So if some of the plastic breaks, it's pretty inexpensive to replace. The bike hasn't been dropped. I've laid it over on its other side to get it out of a hole. Because it hasn't gone down, I'm guessing from vibration or something has caused that tab to break. So that's one of the things that I've seen on the plastics. The tank up front, it's got some chips and dings in it from rocks and stuff getting kicked up. That's going to happen. The more you ride your bike, the more you're going to put wear on it, especially if you're out doing off-road riding like I do. That is very extreme terrain, and it's hard on bikes. I don't clean my bike like I should, so there may be some other things that I don't quite see. I go through and I do a mechanical check. I make sure bolts are tight and things aren't falling off, but I'm not real meticulous about making sure every single piece of plastic is in the perfect shape, because it's covered in dirt, so that's just the way it is. My final assessment on the reliability of this bike. Before I do that, I want to mention a few things. One is KTM hasn't always had the greatest reputation for reliability, and I think it depends on which bike that you're riding and what issues that it's had. But there's a lot of KTM owners out there, and they love their bikes with reliability issues and all. I love this bike. I've only had a handful of issues. The issues that I've had, like the rear shock, I've had those issues with other bikes. So it's not outside of the normal. Now, I did have someone ask me if I knew why KTM used the color orange as their primary color, and I didn't know. So what he had said is that the reason KTM uses orange is so when all the parts fall off your bike on the trail, it's much easier for you to find them. So I found that amusing. But with all kidding aside, as far as reliability, with the 15,000 miles that I've had, I have not been stranded on the side of the road. And to me, that is a big issue. I don't want to ride a bike that I'm concerned that's going to leave me stranded. Now, I did have the shock issue. That is a known issue. It didn't leave me stranded. I was able to get home. Engine-wise, it's ran good. It's strong. It's fun. You can look at all of my other reviews that I've done on this bike. But as far as any significant issues that have left this bike in the shop for an extended period of time, I just haven't had that. There might be some other people that have, and you may see some posts. Keep in mind, when you see posts online, those are the people that are having the most significant issues or being the most vocal. And remember, there's thousands of these bikes out there, and look to see how many people are having the same issues. Thanks for watching. If you have one of these bikes, leave some comments down below on your experience with your bike's reliability, both the good, and if you've had some issues, put those issues down there below so other people can see that. Get out, do some riding, put some miles on your bike, ride safe, and I will see you out there. The normal.